identifying ions. For IGCSE Chemistry, you need to know the chemical tests for identifying ions. A lot of students find this a little bit difficult because you just have to remember them. You can't figure this out, you just have to try and commit them to memory. I find it easier if you break them down into groups and remember them by groups. So I'm just going to run through all of the ones that you need to know for your IGCSE Chemistry. Remember that for all of these, what you are identifying is the ion. So for example, if it was the copper 2 ion, that is used for identifying the Cu2 plus ion in any compound. It doesn't matter what it's attached to. It also doesn't work for copper metal, just Cu on its own. Okay, so it is for identifying ions. So we'll start with probably the simplest one, which is the flame test. In order to carry out a flame test, you take a small amount of the compound that you're testing, usually in solution, but not always. It can be a solid as well. You put it on the end of a wire. The wire has to be unreactive, so the wire that is usually used is a wire called nichrome, which is an unreactive alloy. So you take a small amount of the compound and put it on the end of a nichrome wire, and then very simply you put it into a flame on a Bunsen burner. And different ions will cause the flame to change color. I hope you've all had a chance to try this one out. It's a very kind of fun and interesting one to do. But the colors that you need to know for your IGCSEs are as follows. The lithium ion, which is Li plus 1, so Li plus turns flames a red color. The sodium ion, Na plus, turns flames a distinctive yellow color, which is different, a slightly different yellow to the natural yellow of a Bunsen burner flame. You will definitely be able to see the difference if you carry this one out, but for the purpose of your exam, you can just write yellow. Potassium, K plus, the flame, is a purplish pink color, which is described on the syllabus as lilac. Lilac is a purplish pink. So potassium, makes a purplish pink or lilac color. Calcium, the ion for calcium is Ca2 plus. It makes an orangish red or brick red, so an orangish red color flame. Again, very distinctive, very different to the natural color of the flame. And my favorite, the copper 2 ion, so the Cu2 plus ion, turns flames a green color, a bluish green color. So that's the flame test. Very fast to do, very obvious. There are some other different colored flames, but these are the ones that you need to know for the Cambridge IGCSE syllabus. Not all ions can be detected by a flame test, however, and a lot of the other chemical tests involve adding chemicals to your solution and seeing what happens. A lot of them will make a precipitate. Now remember that a precipitate is a solid formed from a solution. So you mix two chemicals together and it forms a solid. There are quite a lot of these to remember. Again, I find it easier if you break them down into groups. So the first group to have a look at is transition metals. Now again, you don't need to know every transition metal. So the transition metals are the group on the periodic table between group 2 and group 3, starting at scandium on the left there. So you only need to know a few of these. They're all tested for in the same way, which is by adding sodium hydroxide to their solution. What actually happens is they will make a hydroxide precipitate. So for example, if you have something like copper sulfate, you will end up making a copper hydroxide precipitate. And they have distinctive colors. So the ones that you need to know for your IGCSE chemistry, copper, we'll start with that one because I did mention that one. So the copper 2 plus ion in solution, when you add sodium hydroxide, you end up with a light blue precipitate. A light blue precipitate. You can also add a solution of ammonia and you'll get an effect as well. For copper 2 plus, so if you have copper sulfate, copper chloride, and you add ammonia solution, you will get a light blue precipitate. But then if you continue to add the ammonia solution, it will dissolve to form a dark blue solution. So just recap, copper 2 ions give you a light blue precipitate with sodium hydroxide and a light blue precipitate with ammonia that will become a dark blue solution if you add more ammonia. Okay, iron is the next one. Now iron, because it's a transition metal, there's more than one type of iron ion. So there's Fe2 plus or iron 2 and Fe3 plus or iron 3. And they behave differently. They give different colored precipitates. Iron 2 plus, Fe2 plus, when you add sodium hydroxide or ammonia, gives you, it's the same for both of those chemicals, gives you a green precipitate, a grayish green precipitate. Iron 3 plus, so iron 3, for both sodium hydroxide and ammonia, will give you a reddish brown precipitate. It looks like rust. So that's iron. And the last transition metal that you need to remember is chromium. Now chromium is not one that you'll have encountered very often, but it's Cr3 plus. And again, it's if you add sodium hydroxide or ammonia, you get this green colored precipitate here. It is a slightly different green to the iron. You can definitely kind of tell the difference by looking at them. So that's the transition metals. Again, you do just have to remember these, so I would recommend just kind of breaking them down and remembering them by group. That's the transition metal ions. There are some other metal ions that you need to remember as well, which don't give colored precipitates. Now these are a little bit harder because you can't just remember the color. They all give white precipitates, and these are aluminium, so Al3 plus, zinc, so Zn2 plus, and calcium, so Ca2 plus. And they all give white precipitates. So the way to tell the difference between these is their different behaviors with sodium hydroxide and ammonia. So aluminium, if you add sodium hydroxide, gives you a white precipitate. If you add excess sodium hydroxide, it will dissolve. That precipitate will go away. Still with aluminium, if you add ammonia, it will give you a white precipitate, but if you add excess ammonia, that white precipitate will not dissolve. It is insoluble. So a white precipitate, but it's soluble in excess sodium hydroxide, but not in excess ammonia. The calcium ion, on the other hand, Ca2 plus, will give you a white precipitate with sodium hydroxide that will not dissolve when you add excess sodium hydroxide. That's different to aluminium. It will also not give you any precipitate with ammonia. So again, that's different to aluminium. So you have to do both of these tests to tell the difference between these three ions. The third ion is zinc, Zn2 plus. And it will give you a white precipitate with both sodium hydroxide and ammonia, and it will dissolve in excess with both sodium hydroxide and ammonia. So that is different to the calcium, which will not form a precipitate in ammonia and will not dissolve in excess sodium hydroxide, and it's different to the aluminium, which will behave the same under sodium hydroxide but will give you a different result with ammonia. So that's how you tell the difference between those three. That's probably the hardest one to remember, I think, but you just got to try and remember those. But you can group those together and you can tell the difference between them. The third group to remember is the halide ions. So a halide ion is an ion of a halogen. So that's a group 7 element. So there are 5 halogens, but there's only 3 that you need to know about for this test. The 3 halogens you need to know about are chloride, bromide, and iodide. A little bit of a side as an exam tip. Remember the difference between iodide and iodine, chloride and chlorine, bromide and bromine. One is the ion, the one that ends in IDE, and one is the element. So the halides. The test for all of these is exactly the same, so that's easy to remember. The only thing you need to remember the difference of is the color of the precipitate that's formed. So for all 3 of them, you add a little bit of nitric acid to acidify it, and then you add some drops of silver nitrate, aqueous silver nitrate, so silver nitrate solution. And all of them will give you a precipitate. And you just need to remember the color of the three precipitates. So chloride gives you a white precipitate. Bromide gives you a kind of off-white precipitate, which in the textbooks and the syllabus is described as cream. So just describe that as a cream precipitate. And then iodide gives you a yellow precipitate. So the same test for all three, you just end up with a different color. Okay, so that's the halides. The final group that you need to remember for testing the ions is just other. So these are kind of lumped together. There's three different tests for these, but they're kind of all lumped together because they're polyatomic ions. They're ions that consist of more than one atom. So if you have the first one, carbonate, the structure of the carbonate ion is CO3 with a 2- charge, CO3 2-, and you'll find soluble carbonates in things like sodium carbonate and insoluble carbonates in things like calcium carbonate. But the test for both is the same. All you need to do is add an acid. So if you add an acid and it bubbles, and you can collect that gas and see if it's carbon dioxide by doing a lime water test, so that tells you that it is containing, that substance contains the carbonate ion. So the carbonate ion test is add acid and carbon dioxide gets released. The next one is nitrate, which is NO3-, that's the structure of the nitrate ion. And the nitrate ion is a two-step process. You add a little bit of aluminium, solid aluminium, usually an aluminium foil. You add a bit of sodium hydroxide. You warm it very gently. You don't need a Bunsen burner, just warm it a little bit, and it will give off a gas if nitrate is present. You can test that gas with litmus paper to see if it is ammonia. If it is ammonia, then nitrate was the ion that you had. So for a nitrate, add sodium hydroxide and aluminium foil to release ammonia. And finally, sulfate. So the sulfate ion is SO4 2-. The 2- is the charge, it contains 4 oxygens. You'll find that in, for example, sulfuric acid, H2SO4. Find it in copper sulfate, CuSO4. What you do is you add a little bit of nitric acid to acidify it, and then you add a little bit of barium nitrate, drop by drop aqueous barium nitrate, and it will form a white precipitate. So those three are kind of only just lumped together because they're other. There's 3 different tests for them. Probably one of the harder groups to remember, but there's a lot to remember here. Unfortunately, the only way to do it is to memorize it. There's no trick, but I think it does make it easier if you break them down into bits. So flame test, transition metals, other metals, halides, and other ions. Okay, so that is the chemical tests, well, the chemical tests for ions that you need to know for your IGCSE. There are some other chemical tests that you need to know, for example, for gases. We'll cover those another time. Thanks for watching.